Hello and welcome to Fact-Based Living. In this week's episode, we're going to take a look at the Cessna 172. We're going to take a look inside the cockpit at what all the instruments do. And then we're going to discuss some common misconceptions people have about aircraft. So stick around for that. Okay, so before we get in the aircraft, let's take a look at what keeps an airplane up in the air. This white shape here is a cross-section through a wing to show you what it looks like in profile. Now, what keeps a wing aloft is a pressure differential that's created by the way the air flows over the wing. So let me show you kind of how that works. So the first thing you need to consider is whenever dealing with something like a liquid or a solid, you need to consider all of the molecules in that fluid to be kind of like the balls in a Newton's cradle. As one ball gets pushed, that force gets transmitted to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, and finally the one at the end, and causes it to kick off. This is exactly how fluids behave. It's like a giant sheet of Newton's cradle. Every time one molecule gets a force acted on it, it transmits all the way through. So let's look at what's happening with the air flowing over our wing. So air that's below the wing is just going to continue on in a straight path. And it's going to be of a uniform pressure based off the altitude that you're at, and thus the pressure that's actually on the air on its own. Now, what happens when it hits the actual wing is it can go one of two ways. It can either go down or it can go up. So let's look at what happens in the first example. Here we'll put a slipstream that's coming in right at the bottom of the wing. It's going to get slightly deflected, continue to go straight, and go all the way to the back. And because this is all acting like one giant Newton's cradle, there's very little change in the pressure. But now contrast this to a slipstream that's going just a little bit higher up. As it comes in, the wing forces it to take the long route. It has to go up and around the wing. As it goes up and around the wing, it's constantly being pushed by the other molecules of air that are behind it. And so this has to actually increase in speed because it has to keep up with the other air molecules in the stream. It's almost like it's in one long giant train. And so the molecules that are at the engine, the front end of it, are getting pushed by the cars from behind. This happens for any slipstream that's above the center line of the wing. The air comes in, gets deflected, and has to take a longer path. Whenever a fluid has to travel faster and increases in velocity, the pressure in that section of fluid naturally decreases. This is one of those things that's counterintuitive, but this has been well understood and demonstrated for at least 100 years. So because all of this has to go faster in order to keep up with its airstream cousins down here, what you end up with is a pocket of low pressure right on top of the wing. This pocket of low pressure is what gives you your lift, because you have high pressure down below and you have low pressure in this pocket. And so the pressure from below the wing drives the wing up. And because this pocket of low pressure is essentially being generated by the air being disturbed going over the top of the wing, this pocket of low pressure follows the wing. So as you go up in altitude, this same low pressure pocket follows along with the wing, doesn't detach. This means that as you climb, you continue to generate lift and you're able to actually fly. I'm sure quite a few people have seen that little diagrams showing what the forces are on an aircraft. So we just discussed how lift is generated. Now lift is obviously countered by the downward force that causes things to fall. We're going to call that gravity. Now, the engines are putting out power that's driving the aircraft forward, and we call that thrust. And the aircraft has a certain resistance to passing through the air, and that resistance has a tendency to counteract the thrust and slow the aircraft down. That, of course, is drag. But what's not usually explained is kind of the interrelationship between these. If you increase your thrust, you increase the amount of air flowing over and under the wings. This increases your, the increase in thrust increases your speed, and an increase in speed increases your lift. A decrease in thrust will cause a decrease in speed, which will decrease your lift and cause the aircraft to fall. So the relationship between lift and gravity is balanced out by how fast you're moving through the air, and thus how low of a pressure pocket you're creating on top of the wing. Okay? So now that we understand that, let's jump into the airplane and let's see some of the effects of this in action. So here we are back in the aircraft, and I want to give you a quick tour of what some of the instruments are, and then we'll actually see how they work in real flight. So first off, we've got the Airspeed Indicator. That's this large dial gauge right here that says airspeed on it. So the Airspeed Indicator is telling you how fast the air is moving over your wings. Mind you, this is not your ground speed. This is not your speed over the ground like you would get from the speedometer in a car. Rather, this is the speed of the air over your wings. And it comes from a pitot tube hung off the wing here. It's basically a ram air intake that compares the air coming in here to a static patch on the bottom of the aircraft, and it tells you how fast the wind is moving over your wings. This is very important because if you don't get enough wind over your wings, then you start to fall out of the sky, and I'll be demonstrating that later. Something to consider, the wind in your face, the wind coming against you, also plays into your wind speed. So for example, if this said that we were flying at 100 knots, and we were flying into a 30 knot crosswind, that means our airplane is moving at 70 knots. 70 knots plus the 30 knot headwind equals 100 knots over the wings. Next to that is the attitude indicator. This is the one that I took apart on a previous episode and showed the internal workings of. Interestingly enough, I found out that when I did the stream the other day, that the pendulous vanes are actually modeled in X-plane, the operation of the self-erection mechanisms. So I'm going to intentionally upset the aircraft, and we can watch it precess itself back to level. Next to that is your altimeter. Your altimeter is basically a barometric pressure gauge, and as you go up in altitude, the barometric pressure becomes lower, and it uses that to tell what altitude you're at. And periodically during flight, ATC, or the automated weather services that you consult, will tell you what the local barometric pressure is, so you can calibrate this in and make it pretty exact. Nothing fancy though about the altimeter. It literally just is an air pressure gauge. Here is the return coordinator and slip indicator. This tells you the rate of turn when you're actually turning left or right. And this slip indicator tells you how properly coordinated your turns are. If you don't apply the right amount of rudder, then this ball will drift outside of these black lines, and that means you aren't properly coordinating your turn. Here's your directional gyro. This is the one that I said you have to adjust about once every 10 minutes or so in flight, once you're straight and level. And the reason why we use this instead of our float compass is when I go into a turn, pay special attention to how this works. It's actually just a float compass. It's going to tilt over and slosh and become basically impossible to take an accurate reading on. Whereas this one, it will be perfectly accurate through your turn, and it's only after you level out that it may pick up a little bit of precession error and you have to recage it and adjust it. Next to that is our vertical speed indicator. That literally just tells you how many hundreds of feet per minute you're going up or down. It's literally just vertical speed. So those are the main instruments. Everything else here is engine or navigation related. But I wanted to show you a couple of things here in the simulator. And I want to start off by saying, you, as a non-pilot, as just your average everyday Joe civilian, could go up in the air and see this for yourself. Almost every flight school that I've ever gone to has something called like a Discover program, where you can go into an aircraft with an instructor, go up into the air, you will get to fly the plane under the instruction of the instructor, and you will get to actually experience what it's like to fly a small light plane. So everything that I'm showing you here, you could go ahead and do yourself. I'm in the United States. Typically around here, the cost for a Discover flight is anywhere from $50 at some of the really tiny schools to maybe a little bit over $100. For Europeans, it's probably about, what, 50 euros or so. Actually, I guess the euro exchange rate isn't that. It'd be 50 pounds for the UK and maybe 90 to 100 euros for Europeans. But yeah, you can actually get in the airplane. You can do all of the same stuff yourself, with the exception of maybe the spin I'm going to intentionally put the aircraft in. And you can see that this is how aircraft work. So let's actually do some maneuvers here. So currently I'm up at about 7,500 feet. Ground level here is about a mile high. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the autopilot off. I'm going to change my mixture a little bit. And I want to show to you a stall. So what happens in a stall is the aircraft loses airspeed to the point where it basically falls out of the sky. And a good chunk of what you do in flight school is practicing stalls, practicing getting out of stalls quickly, so that when you accidentally get yourself into one, you know at least how to recover without panicking, because they're really no big deal to recover from 9 times out of 10. It's pretty straightforward. So the first type of stall I want to show you is the type of stall that you're going to encounter on landing, and that's a power off stall. So currently I've got the aircraft trimmed for the speed that I'm traveling. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce my power. I'm going to slowly take this down to, maybe 1,000 RPMs. And you can see that the nose is already beginning to dip. We're starting to lose our ability to hold ourselves in the air. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrest that by pulling back on the stick, and I'm going to keep my nose up. Still reducing my power, and I'm holding the nose up, and eventually here you're going to hear a squeaky little horn that's going to warn me that I'm getting into a stall. Now, I'm not quite out of stall yet, but the aircraft is becoming a little difficult to keep on course. It's being a little stubborn. I'm doing this clean with no flaps. So there's there's a stall horn. It's telling me my stall is fully developed. The way to get out of it is relax your hand on the stick, allow the aircraft to go forward, add some throttle back in, and then begin to recover your altitude. So that was a pretty bad recovery. I lost about 500 feet. So let me get back up to 7,500 feet and I'll show you a proper recovery from a stall. The basic idea is you want to let the aircraft dive down a little bit, pick up some airspeed, and then you can grab the yoke, pull back slowly so you don't get a secondary stall, and then recover the aircraft back into a horizontal flying condition. There we go. So we're back at 7,500 feet. Reduce my throttle. Throttle is coming down, coming down, coming down, coming down. And I'm going to hold the nose up, keep the nose from sinking. I'm going to cut the power all the way out. We should hear the stall horn any second. There it goes. Aircraft is starting to stall. I'm going to allow it to fully stall. I'm going to relax my yoke. I'm going to add in some power and recover the aircraft. There, that was better. I only lost 200 feet. So stalls are fairly easy to get out of. Now, it is possible to stall the aircraft with full power on. And this is the type of stall that you would typically see when taking off, because you pull back on the yoke a little bit too hard for what you're trying to do, and the aircraft stalls. So I'm going to build up some speed here, and then I'm going to go leave the throttle full in all the way to the firewall, and I'm going to pull up and I'm going to get our aircraft into a stall. That looks pretty good. So I'm going to pitch up, pitch up, pitch up. Now notice that my airspeed, this dial on the left, is rapidly declining, and I'm holding it up in the air, I'm holding it up in the air, I'm holding it up in the air, and now we're getting really close to a stall. Any second now I should be hearing that stall warning horn kick on. There it goes. So I'm just going to relax the nose. I'm going to allow the airspeed to recover. I'm going to hold things fairly level and just let the airspeed gently recover back up and get me out of that stall. Now the last thing you want to do is, you get yourself, pitched up, you're in all of a sudden into a stall, so you relax it, you bring it back down, you see your airspeed start to cover, and then you yank the stick back up. That gets you into a secondary stall. So what you want to do is just allow the airplane to recover itself, gently pull it back. You're not going to plummet and fall to the ground. So why am I showing you all this stuff with stalls? Well, let's go ahead and turn the autopilot back on and I'll explain. So I'm going to turn attitude hold on and nav hold on. So obviously even small changes in pitch have dramatic effects on what the airspeed of the aircraft is. So if you pitch up, like even a small amount, you will start to slow down. This is because you're climbing, but essentially it's like you're a ball that's been thrown up. As you start to go up, you decelerate, and eventually you start coming back down. Aircraft are no different. Aircraft fly, whether you realize it or not, at all times in what's called a Fugoid motion. Essentially, it's an up and down sine wave. And it goes something like this. The aircraft, pitches up a little bit, and so it starts to lose energy, which means it starts to lose airspeed. As it loses airspeed, eventually it gets to a point where the lift is completely counterbalanced by gravity and it begins to fall. But then, as it falls, it picks up more airspeed. This gives it more lift. So then the aircraft begins to rise. And so constantly, over and over and over again, an aircraft is following a sine wave up and down motion where it's constantly rising, losing energy, falling, gaining energy, rising back up. I'm going to show you kind of an exaggerated example of this, but just understand that at all times the aircraft is doing something very similar. So I'm going to turn off the autopilot. Got my aircraft nicely trimmed where I'm not touching the stick currently, and it's flying nice, straight, and level. I'm going to zoom out here and pitch up so you can see. Now, the dial that I want you to pay special attention to is the vertical speed dial. Because what I'm going to do is I'm just going to gently pick the pull the stick back and allow the airplane to climb, and then I'm just going to let the stick go and let it fly the way it wants to. So here we go. Move us back to the left a little bit, and I'm going to put us into a gentle 500-foot climb. I'm not going to mess with the throttle, but now watch. So now we've already started to fall, and as we fall, our airspeed starts to go up. As our airspeed goes up, we get more lift. Eventually, if I put enough energy into this, there we go. We start climbing back up. Only now, once we cross the zero, we're losing energy. And so the aircraft is eventually going to hit equilibrium again, and then it's going to start to fall. And there it goes. And so you can sit there and you can watch the vertical speed just go up and down and up and down. And even when an aircraft is flying what's considered to be as close to perfectly straight and level as you can possibly get, it's doing a smaller version of this where it's going up 10 feet, down 10 feet, up 10 feet, down 10 feet, following that sine wave Fugoid motion. Now, I've seen some people argue that aircraft, as they travel, should constantly have to dip their nose. And I've already explained why the gyroscope is one factor where, since the gyroscope is constantly precessing itself back to level, you're not going to have to dip your nose. But the real reason why is the aircraft is going to keep you at whatever altitude you're at whatever speed setting you're at, on its own through this Fugoid motion. So say we hit a gust of air and it gives us a little bit of extra lift. So the airplane balloons a little bit. Eventually it's going to hit equilibrium and it's going to begin to fall right back down. Now I want you to look at our altimeter. It's not moving all that much, but our vertical speed is going up and down and up and down. So now we've arrested at the bottom end, we picked up a bunch of energy, and now we're flying back up. And we're going to start gaining altitude. And we'll just continue to go in this seesaw motion. So that's literally why you wouldn't have to dip your nose, is because as you fly, if at any point you start to get slightly farther away from the planet, and that is essentially what you're doing when you're going up, you're going to start to lose airspeed. The aircraft is eventually going to pitch back forward. You're going to start to dive. You'll regain your airspeed. You'll go right back up and start the whole process all over again. So that's why that is pretty much one of the dumbest arguments somebody could say is, well, the aircraft should have to dip its nose. Well, no. You get farther away from the planet, you lose speed, and therefore you go back down, but then you gain speed, and you just repeat the process all over again. So I hope that part kind of explained a couple of the things I was talking about in the stream yesterday. If anybody wants, I would be more than happy to do another stream where we can do this live. I am working on getting my internet stuff fixed, and once that's up, we'll have better quality, higher resolution streams. But until then, I'm Newton. This has been Fact-Based Living, and more episodes are coming next week. Talk to you then.